Uh, oh, it's kind of like a split lane situation there. Yeah, and we're live straight from Amsterdam, Tallahassee, and Toronto twice. This is a special edition of the Nomad Community Office Hours. I'm your host, Kerim Satirli, and we're here with Jacquie Grindrod, Charlie Voiselle, and Byron Wolfman. Before we get started, if you have questions or comments, we'd love for you to interact with us in the chat. We've already got one question in there. Super good. Keep it coming. But as you do so, please keep our code of conduct in mind. In general, be welcoming, inclusive, friendly, and patient, considerate, and respectful. Just don't bring shame to your parents. You can review our code of conduct at hashicorp.com/community guidelines, and we'll have a link for that in the chat as well. And with that, let's get started. Byron, first question for the audience, not from the audience. Are you the Wolfman from Toronto?
Yes, we're going to go with yes.
Awesome. I like it. Well, I have you. What do you do at HashiCorp?
So I work on the SRE team for HCP. HCP is the HashiCorp cloud platform. Right now we have essentially console as a service. You can sign up and launch a console cluster in a few minutes, and it's operated by the people who write and maintain console. We have Vault in beta right now. And as part of the SRE team, we're supposed to be the center of operational excellence. So teams that are writing the services that actually bootstrap this console and Vault as a service are on call for the software they write, but not everyone necessarily has had the experience being on call. The thing before DevOps is that dev writes software, ops gets paged. We're moving to a model in the industry now where kind of you build it, you own it. But SRE is still there's still an opportunity there for to be the center of operational excellence, because operations isn't just necessarily a technical skill set of being a sysadmin, for example. It's like an approach to incident management, to reliability, to monitoring and metrics. And so the SRE team is kind of this very cross-functional team that goes where the fires are and tries to help teams become the best versions of themselves, so that not only can they respond to services that are on fire, but build services that are reliable, that maybe don't catch fire as much.
Like things that don't catch fire. That brings me joy. Charlie, welcome back. You've been on the stream before, but for the people that have missed those sessions, I wouldn't know why, but it happens. What do you do?
Currently, I work on the HashiCorp education team, making Nomad Learn guides. But before that, I was in support for the Nomad product, and so it has been my focus for about 4 years now. It's my favorite product, and people have asked me like, "Hey, would you like to work on X product?" And I'm like, "No, thank you. I like Nomad." So
I'm good here. Yeah, I get that. Jacquie, fellow developer advocate, what do you do?
Nomad, just glad, apparently. But it's funny because I'm usually hosting this, and the fact that I'm not hosting this, I'm actually getting speaker anxiety, and I'm like, hello, okay, we've got jitters. But anyway, yeah, so Kerim and I are both developer advocates here at HashiCorp. I specifically work with the Nomad product, and typically I do things like, I guess, building out demos or proof of concepts, and then either writing talks or learn guides or things around them. We also kind of talk to our internal teams and our either users or customers to kind of get feedback from them and bring that into the product, and just kind of, make sure everybody's like getting a chance to give their feedback and talk about it, and we get that in.
Feedback is important. So I'm curious, what happens behind the scenes? We alluded to that, but something happens behind the scenes at our learn guides and talks, and first snippet, just something to get the crowd excited. Charlie.
It's always interesting. It's always interesting to try and come up with a interesting workload for Nomad, because it does so much. And to be able to sort of express the value proposition, it's like, hey, we can run Windows stuff. We can run non-container workloads. But the second you say we can run non-container workloads, what does that mean? And, oh gosh, how can I find a representative workload that's interesting, right? Because if I give you a Java hello world, I didn't show you anything more than, oh, cool, it can run the Java command. So being able to hunt down interesting interesting workload and then learn them really quick and then create guides around them is sort of, it's fun, but also maddening at times.
Finding interesting workloads to run, I can see how that would also be something for Byron in a different way.
Yeah. The place where I first really started using Nomad, the shop at the time was migrating from a Heroku, and Heroku is a fantastic service in no small part because they have a very opinionated way about how you're meant to run a service. And it turns out that the way that they want you to run a service on a Heroku dyno makes it very suitable for containerizing and putting in something like ECS or Nomad or Kubernetes. Where things get interesting, though, is that once you get that flexibility and teams are kind of unshackled from the limitations of something like a Heroku dyno, they want to do a lot of interesting, weird stuff. We had tried to run software like Apache Flink and Apache Pulsar in Nomad, and not all of these things are necessarily suitable, I would say, for a containerized workload. Nomad can run all of them, but sometimes you find yourself kind of with a square peg and a round hole. In terms of some of the more interesting workloads, Apache Airflow, I keep seeing work come up, for example, to get Airflow better integrated with Nomad, because the interesting things about these workloads aren't just necessarily what you bring to the scheduler and you say, please make this run for me. Something like Airflow is itself a scheduler, and there's some really neat opportunities for integrating that. So Airflow is like it's a data science tool that can kind of kick off these Python DAGs. And beyond just running those DAGs within the Airflow container itself, there's these really great opportunities to make your Nomad cluster the general purpose scheduler, where Airflow, wakes up in the morning and it says, okay, I have these 100 pipelines that I need to run, and it kind of schedules those all with Nomad. There was actually a team at my last organization that did some custom work on that. So I think like the type of guides that you find are very good at, like, here's a container, here's how to run it, here's like a raw exec job, here's how you can run it. But if you treat your capacity as an API, which is really what, for example, EC2 brought to cloud computing, something like Nomad can let you run some far more interesting workloads, like far more dynamic workloads than I've got a container and make it run. It can become, part of your application.
Yeah, those sound definitely a little bit more interesting than the example we have in the docs, which I believe is sleep. Obviously, yes. For a documentation page, it definitely works. But I'm curious. You mentioned difficult workloads. What's the trickiest problem you've wrangled?
The trickiest problem, it's almost less to do with Nomad and more about the abstractions that you introduce, because these, especially if you're using Nomad to run containerized workloads, you are running abstraction upon abstraction upon abstraction. And some software isn't necessarily made for this world or requires a network overlay that kind of removes these concerns. To give a very specific example, there will be some software that needs to gossip with its counterparts. Console clusters, for example, gossip. I would say you never want to run like console inside Nomad. That's kind of a fun problem not to have. But the software that gossips, usually the way that you'll configure it is you will tell each instantiation of the software, you will listen on this port and advertise this IP address. And if you have like a network overlay, that kind of still works, although troubleshooting it is now diving through 10 different layers. If you don't have a network overlay, if you're just using the Docker daemon to expose ephemeral ports, then you have this application that's saying, okay, I'm here at IP 1234 on port 8080, but that port only exists inside the container's namespace. So when something tries to gossip to it, it can't find it. It hits a wall because that port has been mapped to something like 32,000. or so. So running that kind of software, or I like to describe it as like tricking that kind of software into running an environment where it wasn't really made for it. You kind of have to consider the trade-offs, and it doesn't always work out.
Lots of considerations. I'm mostly using Terraform, and with a lot of these answers, with a lot of these questions, the answer is generally, it depends. You need to find your very specific area. So one point that was made in the chat, and thank you for joining us there, is we need a repository with more job ideas and stateful applications. Charlie, maybe do you want to share your thoughts on what you're working on around that?
Oh my gosh, thoughts. I have thoughts, lots of thoughts. So, yes, stateful jobs. One of the interesting problems that we run into with stateful jobs is Nomad's bias for availability. When clients get lost, but suppose the workload's still running, Nomad will want to start a new instance of a thing. And that for certain jobs that really depend on uniqueness could be very unfortunate. Zookeeper is a great example. Right now, I've got a sample job that I used to demonstrate templating with Levant. And it allows you to build a node Zookeeper cluster. You have to have supported host volumes for it. And the nice sort of pro tip / trick / hack there is that the host volumes provide enforced locality. And that is critical because stateful volumes want to be by their data. CSI will eventually solve that for places that have CSI compatible storage. But for right now, using an abstraction over a directory on the client lets you throw an NFS behind it, an iSCSI, your favorite storage medium, some cluster backend even. So that's really, like, host volumes are surprisingly powerful, and I think people underutilize them because CSI is a little bit cooler. But also, my internal bias is still data center. So sometimes, the fact that you're talking about, I must take magical disk from cloud provider and plug it into magical machine and do a little bit of praying and hope it works, or that the hook and unhook does the trick, then that's sort of the challenge there. It's funny because Kerim, I'm going to tell on Kerim. Kerim backchanneled and he asked me if we should share my example repo, and I would say we could totally do that. I will say that it is poorly curated. And there are some things in there that are old, but I am working on some jobs in the examples folder, or the applications folder rather, at the top level, that I think are really starting to look reasonable and provide people an idea for how to do things. I've got a kind of a cool WordPress job in there that will spin up its own Postgres. Geez, words just fail me right now. It's something about talking in front of people that makes me just...
I think code, no matter if it's old or not, it will be helpful for people to see what your considerations are. And that actually brings me to my next question. I'm curious, what are the considerations that you have before building something with all of the jobs? I'm sure there's some things that are super specific, let's say security or maybe locality, but I'm sure there's also some things that always come back.
Service discovery, always service discovery. If I had $1, and I think one of the things that people hope for when they walk up to Nomad is that we did magic with console. And we specifically didn't. I actually started to write a mini guide / rant / blog post / I don't know, about name resolution with Nomad and console. And there are great learn guides about integrating console into your DNS for your node. And I'm going to make that more obvious in the Nomad flow, that you need to wire that, because it's great to be able to locate your workload, and critical. I mean, honestly, Nomad is doing a lot of dynamic magic with ports. It's doing magic with service names. your job needs to be able to find its components. And that is probably like, I think people who've graduated from Docker have gotten used to having Docker magic help you identify where your partners are. And we don't provide that level of magic because we really want that to be more integrated into the honest operating system name resolution path.
Yes, these are definitely very valid considerations. Byron, actually, same question for you, because you have a very different take on this, because you're forged by the fires of having to keep things running.
Sorry, what's the question? Specific considerations?
Yeah, specific considerations that you have before building jobs and before building. I mean, obviously, the job is just one tiny bit of the whole setup.
I would say, I mean, there's so many things, and some of these things are so internalized that I'm probably not even going to give voice to them until I think of them tomorrow. But at least top of mind right now would actually be cluster capacity, because something that will sometimes happen is an application will run out of memory, or it will start to get real greedy with the CPU. And Nomad jobs make it easy to just kind of bump that number and redeploy the job, and now we're good. But the cluster may not necessarily have capacity, especially if you're measuring that capacity, like if you're measuring that capacity in aggregate. For example, if I have 10 nodes and I'm not measuring the aggregate capacity, I might see that I have 20 gigahertz of CPU available and like 50 gigabytes of memory. So I can just crank the slider up to the moon. What's going to happen is somebody is going to review that job spec file and say, well, I know you're asking for 8 gigabytes of memory for your RAM, but we actually use M5 larges. And so our nodes don't have more than that. The cluster says there's enough capacity, but you can't find an individual node to actually deploy it to. So when you go to deploy it, it's going to give you a resource exhaustion error. So I think like being aware of what kind of capacity you actually have is like, it's really important in those early days to begin measuring your cluster, and specifically having a dashboard to measure the cluster capacity. In SRE, we talk a lot about having these things automated, having monitors, kind of things, robots automatically managing these things for us. But something that I also try to stress is that no robot is as good at pattern matching as a human. So, when designing these clusters, as a software developer, you don't necessarily have to know all this stuff about the cluster. Maybe somebody else who's made the cluster is going to jump in and help you out with it. But at least the operators and SREs and infrastructure people who build the cluster, I think from day one, or at least day two, because day two is kind of the theme of today's discussion, have a way to be able to eyeball your cluster. Definitely look at that dashboard at least once a day. It's going to tell you about the problems that you don't have today, but the trends that will help you avoid the problems that happen tomorrow. There were definitely cases where where we had a cluster that had plenty of capacity, but as a service goes from a small thing with a handful of clients to being wildly popular, the resources that you granted your apps are going to slowly ratchet up over time, and that cluster that you designed 3 years ago is going to need to get a lot bigger.
The day two operations are heavily influenced by the choices you make on day one, right?
Yes. And day two lasts forever. That's a Bridget Cronout quote that I stole.
Day one is, like until your first job runs, and then day one ends. And then when everything starts scaling, hopefully your choices can scale with that. I'm curious, Jacquie, what drew you to do a day one for Nomad in the first place and allowed you to have a day two?
What drew me to?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I have this job where I set things up. No, before that, I had worked with ECS, Docker Swarm orchestration, and like Kubernetes. So kind of building some stuff around ECS and Swarm and trying to make that work a little bit more like what I actually wanted. And then Kubernetes on multiple clouds. So coming here, I guess the draw was that I really like this orchestration space. I like the pipeline space, and that's kind of why I'm on Nomad. I don't know, I just enjoy doing this kind of work. It's fun. There's a lot of things you get to play with and consider. In terms of day one to day two, I mean, it's a bit different as a DA. So like I've said this before, but as a DevOps engineer, it kind of felt a little bit linear. Like, you're always working towards a goal. Your goal is probably like, production release or something with go live, but you're kind of always working towards that. Maybe you go up and you're setting some new things up, you go down, but you're always kind of taking a path in that direction. As a DA, it kind of feels a little bit more like my goal is to talk to the community and get feedback, and I can kind of build or do whatever reaches that goal as far as our team's concerned and what we do. So kind of that day one to day two is mostly around like, what are people asking for and what do I need to build to reach that point? So right now I'm working on getting, you're working on this with me actually, but doing the Terraform and Nomad starters for Azure and AWS. And I'm working on that with the goal of getting towards being able to do console ingress and terminating gateway learn guides. So it's a bit long of an answer, but
It's definitely an interesting ecosystem, and Levant comes up a lot. And actually, we got a question about that. Is there a reason to use Levant over Terraform for templating?
Yeah,
I'll ask that to Charlie.
Yeah, so this is one I have feels about also. And we get asked the question frequently, and what I like to share with people, this is my opinion. We're going to start with, in my opinion, Terraform is great at making things where it can maintain and predict the state at the end of the game, where it's state stable. And one of the tricks about Nomad is that a job can move, elements of it can change, and that can sometimes make Terraform unhappy. The Terraform provider does the best it can with that, but because of those challenges, it's not strictly ideal for deploying jobs. I think it's great for building Nomad clusters and setting up ACLs, building the state of a cluster, but deploying jobs is more, I think it's better suited for something that does not have that strict state monitoring requirement. And I like to compare this to Amazon auto scaling groups in Terraform. There's a lot of information you can no longer get from Terraform when you use an ASG, because that information, if it changed, would necessarily dirty the state in a way that would confuse Terraform and make it want to rebuild things. So that's my Terraform versus Levant babble. Levant is nice because it can template and also watch deployments so that you get this really pretty experience of pre-rendering, rendering, deploy, and knowing that it got there. But
I like the example with auto-scaling groups. That's definitely an easy one to grasp at that point. Byron, anything to add to this question?
Yeah, I'm going to make the Nomad and Terraform teams upset with me by the end of today, because I'm not necessarily going to take the opposite stance. But something I find with these tools is that there's the way they're designed, the way they're documented, and then there's the way that they actually get used. And kind of meeting people where they are on that third one is, I think, fairly important. Because when we talk about using Terraform to deploy Nomad, Terraform does have a Nomad provider, so you can define your jobs. And at this point, I agree with pretty much everything that Charlie has stated. It's good for asserting static things that won't change very often. But you can also misuse Terraform. Maybe misuse isn't even the right word. You can use Terraform differently. You can use Terraform to render out a file. And so the question becomes at this point, are you using Terraform because it's familiar and it kind of does everything you need and you're already using it in a bunch of places and you can render this file as part of your pipeline that you then use the API or CLI to say, okay, Nomad, deploy this. Or what are you really looking for is that a templating language, and is Terraform the correct templating language for this sort of thing? So I think there are certainly some use cases where you can combine modules and some of the smarter pieces of HCL2 to actually use Terraform to dynamically render your job spec file, especially if you have a lot of Nomad jobs that are going to be like 99% identical, but have a couple of different knobs to fiddle with. You can use Terraform to produce that job file in your pipeline and then deploy it. Is it the correct solution? And ultimately, when selecting something like Terraform, Levant, or any of the other templating languages, or even building your own, like something important to consider is that you are giving shape to the way that people are going to build their software. Even before somebody makes the first commit on a new service, they might already have some existing bias around how these services are already deployed. So which one should you use? Whichever one kind of works best with your pipeline, which is a bit of a cop-out answer, but like don't be set in stone, and do be prepared to find out like 2 or 3 years later that actually we need to change things. And try to design your pipeline so that the inputs that go in, whether it's Terraform, a Levant, or anything behind it, is something that's kind of loosely coupled that you can swap out.
I was going to ask if you were advocating for loosely coupled interactions, but clearly you are. I like it. It makes a ton of sense. It's if you think about everything as a module and as a building block, then it's essentially a contract we're keeping. I like it. This is very useful. So I'm curious. On day one, resource considerations don't happen a lot, and we touched upon this briefly at the beginning. And I know I can specify CPU and memory, and I believe even the GPU if I have that requirement. I'm sure that I'm forgetting stuff. How do I calculate that? What should I be looking for in my dashboards?
Wait, you have dashboards on day one? I'm sorry, carry on.
I mean, there is a telemetry option. So all I did was install an agent and got my data to show up in a monitoring platform. And now I have many numbers, and I have no idea what they mean.
Oh, wow. The biggest can of worms ever. So I'll take a crack at it. And this is where we get to the hilarious. It super depends. It's very use case driven. Some of the things that I think people should look for right off the shot are pending jobs. If you have pending jobs building up, then that means your work is not landing. And that's definitely a sign of SAD in your cluster. The other thing is we have the metrics page. We are like sort of skunk works talking around the, how can we build a day one dashboard for folks? Many projects and demos have some form of a very specific dashboard in them. And it would be awesome. Like it would be better if we actually had those more centralized in a way that we could hand somebody at least a drop in. This is the beginning of monitoring. It is a dream of mine and has been ever since I was in support. I will say that someone just hooked me up in the back channel and they're like, hey, log raft last contact. And they're right. That talks about your connectivities between your server nodes. Raft metrics are really pretty important and occult, let's say. They're difficult to read. They're documented across 4 different now products and look similar. So the truth lies in there somewhere. This is one of those things as a library user that I've been a little bit disappointed in, and I hope we're going to encourage everybody to do better on this one, just because anytime we can give end users visibility into a really complex distributed system, then we're going to help them win. And I'd like to hear Byron's hot takes on that.
I'm curious too.
I was actually wondering if the question was regarding the cluster itself or resource quotas for the jobs.
I think a little bit of both, actually, because if my jobs aren't landing, that might be a job configuration error, way I see it, or a badly sized cluster.
Okay. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is agree with everything that Charlie said, in particular, +1 to the pending allocations. Because a job should really only be pending for a very short time Nomad is trying to find where that job, or rather where the job's allocations are going to go. And so if it's pending for a long time, that's usually because there are either resource exhaustions or a constraint that it can't make. But as far as the jobs themselves, certainly a conversation that I have had a lot is I've got a new service. What are my, like, what kind of resources should I assign to it? And, you know, there isn't really a good answer. Typically, those type of resource quotas will be cargo culted from whatever service is either the most similar, whatever was kind of top of mind at the time. You know, this service, is it something that kind of tries to gulp the entire database in a nightly job? Does that mean that it's going to use more memory every day? Does it paginate? How much memory does it use on the developer's laptop? And does that even really matter because the runtimes in production are different? So selecting those initial resource quotas is quite hard. And I would say that if you're not sure, to err on the side of more rather than less. Memory is a hard quota. If you try to exceed the amount of memory that you give your job, Killer swoops in and just knocks it over. If you try to exceed your CPU usage, that's actually not as bad. You know, some of the job drivers allow you to define like hard CPU versus soft CPU. But things like C groups and Docker, the CPU, like the regular CPU full stop, is actually a soft limit where you give something 1 gigahertz, and if the node has more available and the job wants to use more, it's going to. So that CPU limit is much more often used for scheduling decisions, where, you know, even if you have a job that doesn't use very much CPU, you still might want to give it a somewhat high quota so that it kind of sticks out its elbows and doesn't get just like clobbered by I don't know, the daily ETL that crunches numbers for the marketing team. Having a high CPU quota means that Nomad will try to schedule it somewhere where it thinks that node has sufficient resources. And sufficient resources means like however many resources have already been allocated. Not necessarily how high the CPU is pinned, but what's been allocated. So that's kind of a non-answer, like, what do I assign my resources? I don't know, big. But like after you assign them and after you deploy the job, keep an eye on it. You know, especially once a new service has launched and been stabilized after a few days, its resource usage hopefully are going to be fairly stable, and you can kind of start to tune and right size that. And as a bit of a plug, Nomad Enterprise Autoscaler actually has a feature that allows you to, like, it'll look at what kind of resources a job are using and say, hey, I've got some suggestions. This one maybe needs a little bit more CPU. It's kind of hungry, or this one is like way over provisioned on memory. Otherwise, like, I mean, you can write these own tools, but they're, as it turns out, quite difficult.
Suggestions are always
I so love that you mentioned that, though. That's the autoscaler, because it really dovetails with metrics. You need to have an APM so that the autoscaler has something to go ask questions to, and being able to, you know, collect metrics first day, find metrics, just get them someplace.
I think also calling it killer is just so harsh. I mean, it makes it sound like it's doing something bad, but it's really just creating a learning opportunity for you.
It's the system protector. It does an a necessary but unfortunate job.
It is definitely necessary. Jackie, have you ever had bad experiences with killers?
Probably, but it was also probably buried in my sock shop demo that I was working on, where I distinctly remember going, so we went off Kent's GCP guide, which I should probably drop in the chat right after this. It's really, really good. Like, I cannot stress enough how great it is. It's probably more secure than most things I've built in my career, which is, but he's also a security expert. So, but yeah, so kind of in there, I'm pretty sure I had own problems, but the majority of the problems we had were kind of around me learning console and understanding how everything worked. So it was probably buried in all of that. I don't know if Louise remembers. He might. Sorry, I've been trying to dig for the autoscaler demo that we have, because I know we got a couple questions about what a monitoring dashboard looks like. And our auto-scaling demo does have some. I'm just trying to find the code, but
You can grab the Learn Guide. It's featured in the Nomad product top page.
oh really? I didn't even realize we Learn Guided that. That's awesome.
Oh yes, horizontal cluster auto scaling.
Oh, there it is.
So if you're just joining us and wondering, what are these people talking about? We have a whole site dedicated to learning guides at learn.hashicorp.com for all of our products, with some really good in-depth guides on how to do things. No matter if you're doing your day 1 or day 0 operation of how do I get this installed, or more advanced things like autoscaling, which is definitely not a day 1 problem, unless you run Node. Charlie, that chuckle makes me think there's a story there.
Well, it's one of those things where you get in there, and like Byron said, sometimes apps take a surprising amount of memory, or just burst up to a surprising amount of memory. Actually, it was the thing that when you're talking about Node, it tickled my brain and reminded me of the terrible JSON loading thing that someone found in Grand Theft Auto, like those weird, unexpected things that your actual libraries are doing, where you could be doing horrible operations or super inefficient operations because they weren't designed for strings this shape, for example, strings this length. And so being able to watch your app, being able to give it a place that might stop it so that you can have a moment to investigate that balloon, right? It may go away in a GC, but that is almost assuredly problematic.
I think that was actually a pretty nice example of fixing it from the outside and not having access to all the metrics we normally have access to, which makes me wonder how would you go about fixing that? Let's say you're a developer, your jobs are deployed on Nomad, and developer in the traditional sense. What are some good metrics that I, from the outside, can keep in mind, or some good steps to make my operations team happy?
That's an excellent question. And I think that being able to understand the dynamics of your workload are pretty critical. Like Byron said, you're probably going to have to aim high when you deploy it. And the other thing is to inspect over time. Like, pay attention to your workload. Don't assume a library is your friend. Node, NPM, just NPM install the universe. It happens, I've seen it. Like some little tiny micro dependency that you used one time to maybe do a function helper, and all of a sudden you've pulled in 85 different libraries. And you're like, what? I think the other thing that is extremely useful to bring to savvy when you're coming to Nomad is, like, how does your app use the network? Like what connections do you need to make? What connections do you absolutely not want to make? How do you hug isolation and cope with that? And adventures in DNS. Like, it want to talk about, I saw a haiku about it being DNS, and it doesn't become it's at its most true when you start to add network abstractions into the party, where you have limited visibility. So I think being able to really articulate what your network requirements are is critical when you're developing for Nomad.
Yeah, it's always a DNS problem. Yeah, we've heard that one before. I mean, even with service discovery, at the end, it's just knowing which machine to talk to, which, it can be hard. Jacquie, I'm curious.
Hello, I'm still giggling because I went and found the haiku. I'm sorry. But yes, what do you want to know?
It is a beautiful haiku. And for our audience that's missing it, I'll do my best at making this haiku sound really good. It's not DNS. There's no way it's DNS. It was DNS.
I'm here for dramatic poem readings or haiku readings for community officers. But
we do everything here.
Yeah,
I think
I
that's the
sang some
important part.
Little Mermaid ones.
But for community questions, which I know more people are here for than my haiku readings, we've got an interesting one come up right now. We're trying to run a Java app that uses translation files under local/translate. How can we periodically download new files to that directory without having to restart the whole job? I like that.
We're just throwing in Java questions at Jackie like right away. Oh. I think Charlie's probably the better person for this one. Not to throw you under the bus there, but I haven't run any Java workloads yet. So
this is a very interesting question. There are a few life hacks that we use around Nomad jobs to get information into an allocation without doing a full restart. One of them is the template stanza. The challenge that I see for this one is that unless the job defines the translation, or I'm trying to think about, so if it's in the template stanza, it would need to be accessible with console template, which is the library we use to power the template stanza. You would have to be able to fetch it using console template. And I'm trying to think of the magical ways to get data in and out of, this is how it depends on how large those files are, I guess, would be the really big thing. Another idea is you could use a sidecar app sitting next to your Java application that is downloading the files and then maybe uses a console key to signal your Java app to reload those files, if that's a possibility. Because there are a few things that you can do when you have template changes. Signal, restart, or do nothing. And that could be a way to do this. Yeah, if KV is an option, like that is probably one of the least friction ways to do it. It'd be easiest. But like I say, again, really depends on the size of the value. Yeah, I'm here for like the weird hacks.
That was a very interesting question. It also made me think KV would indeed be my first go-to. I like the sidecar principle though a little bit more. Because with translation files, when I'm thinking KV, it sounds like a lot of keys. It sounds like a lot of queries to make and make sure everything is up to date. So yeah, sidecar, definitely a good one. If you're just joining us, we're here with some folks from the Nomad Community team. We're talking day 2 operations, and we're facing, well, we're not facing, we're enjoying your questions. They are nice. They have been educational to me. So I'm pretty sure others have gotten value out of this as well. Actually, Charlie, a follow-up question for you. Are there plans to add more job communication tutorials using something like, I'm guessing in this case, Console Connect?
Oh, Console Connect tutorials. Yes, I would love to get more Console Connect tutorials. Yes, they're in the pipeline. I do, because Connect is such a fascinating thing, and it's exciting to be able to throw the mesh right on top of Nomad and sort of have Nomad be a part of the party. We are working on more Connect tutorials. Count Dash, it's good, but it's just not quite good enough. It's not quite expressive enough, I think. I think it's a great teaser. So yes, I really want to do something more workloady in Connect. And if somebody had a suggestion for something that was not comically hard, I would love them to throw it at me at Twitter or
at Angry Cub.
At Angry Cub, at me.
That works. Awesome. So if you have feedback for tutorials, thoughts that you want to share, drop Charlie.
Kerim, you're hateful.
Kerim over here like, hey, did we just open a fire hose? Let's just make that a little bit bigger.
I just want to make sure
I can't make any
members have a
promises.
chance.
No promises, y'all. I just, it never hurts for me to actually have an understanding of what might be useful for folks. Again, like we talked about in the beginning, sometimes I just have to pull it out of thin air. And, while I may be able to establish a pattern that could be useful, if I'm not articulating that well enough, then you might just totally miss out and just like, oh, he's like, for example, the zookeeper pattern being buried in a tutorial called Abstract Job Specs doesn't necessarily help people locate that shape. And so being able to try and help people surface interesting jobs and, like Shantanu said, try and get a community like a repo where we can sort of talk about some of these first in class and even like developing emerging jobs, right? Where someone wants to be able to begin to sort of suggest, hey, I think this is a cool pattern. And we're like, okay, this is what, play around with it a little bit and talk about it as, the Nomad team, the DAs, the Nomad engineers and the community members to be able to sort of say, how can we make this super awesome and really valuable for folks?
Yeah, I think having tutorials that are valuable and show you what you're building, and we just got a super good suggestion for that before and after with Console Connect to show the difference, the diff essentially, of how your infrastructure and how your flow looks like. I think that's really great because that does make it useful, right? Question from Taylor. What went away from my screen? Sorry about that. Are there ways to have Nomad spin up load balancers or expose application services like you would normally do in Cube? And maybe Byron, curious, because this is kind of the intro to a follow-up question I have.
All right. So the short answer is no. The longer answer is yes, but not in any way that you would want to actually maintain. As far as first-party capabilities, no. Nomad, the official job drivers are for things like Docker, Java apps, raw exec. I know there's a handful of other things I'm forgetting, but it doesn't really have like a general kind of resource scheduler. An old colleague of mine used to describe Kubernetes as being something that has a scheduler. Nomad is a scheduler. And so the type of resources that they manage are different. Now, as far as the longer yes, but you won't like it answer, you can do some fairly horrible things. If again, you think of the software not as it's been designed, as it's been documented, but as it actually works. You can do things like please nobody do this and then ask us why it doesn't work, because you're not supposed to do this. But you could have a service job with pre-run and a pre-stop hook. And when the pre-start hook runs, it could do something like create a load balancer using Terraform. And then when you stop the job, it runs its pre-kill hook and it tears it down. The reason you have to be very careful about this is because Nomad wasn't really designed to do this. So especially when you run into problems such as lost nodes, lost allocations, network partitions, what the job does and how those pre-start and pre-kill hooks actually run, you could wind up bringing down your front-end production load balancer unexpectedly because there was a hiccup between two availability zones. So you can do it. You can kind of hack it together. I would not necessarily recommend doing that. Nomad does have a plugin architecture. You'd kind of have to look at it to see if it would even be suitable for that sort of thing. But for a large enough company with the resources and requirements for Nomad to do that, it would probably be possible for you to build something suited to that purpose, as opposed to co-opting pre-start and pre-kill hooks. If you're a smaller or medium-sized shop that just kind of needs this sort of functionality, then at the moment, no, it doesn't support that in any way that will make your ops team happy.
You've given me ideas, and I'm not sure that's a good thing.
I'm so sorry.
I love them though. This is definitely an interesting problem to face, and I was thinking about yeah, the approach you're mentioning might not be the best, but I'm sure there's some inspiration in there. I got to play with this and see where we can go and what kind of mayhem we can cause by having this happen. So Taylor had a follow-up to this, which happens to be something we talked about earlier today. Would it be a better pattern to have a Terraform module instantiate your job on Nomad and then handle security groups and load balancers and everything else? And I think that brings us back to our initial question of when should you use a Terraform provider and when not? Yeah.
I can talk forever, but I mostly have bad, dangerous ideas that are going to make our support team very unhappy.
Yeah, I think the biggest.
Terraform's...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead,
Byron. Give me the biggest thing that makes me nervous about this approach is you have to make sure you're using remote state. That is like the absolute most important part of this party. Like if you're using local state, you are asking for a pile of pain and sad, because Nomad makes it a best effort to migrate the Alector to the next place. But in the case where the node is partitioned or can't be reached, it's like, nope, and just starts. So, there is, there are a few settings on the disk resource, I believe it's the disk resource, that lets you sort of ask for sticky, but there be dragons there. Think of it more as like a cache space you could use. But like Byron saying, to be able to use Terraform, remote state. Oh God, remote state.
Yeah, I mean, in choosing one or the other, there's it's not only about what kind of problems you want to solve, but what kind of problems you want to have, because very few of these things are a free lunch. Nomad, I think, is wonderful for, we have all of these cookie cutter apps that look almost exactly the same, and we there's almost no differentiation in how they're operated. So let's put them all in a cluster and let it worry about that. That solves a very hard problem. You gain some new problems though, which is that now we have to kind of learn how to live in this abstracted, containerized, scheduled, distributed world. And I think that's actually a better problem to have than the one of undifferentiated lifting. So, especially for the sake of for the sake of the rest of my team, I want to be clear that, as much as I'm making fun of myself about these dirty hacks that you can do to use Nomad to co-opt it and do these really gnarly things, our team, because we're supporting like a very broad platform, we're kind of looking for the most boring things of all. Because when they break, we want them to break in the least spectacular manner. And so, going back to the choice of Terraform, because, well, I've got a load balancer and security groups and this job, and they're kind of all related. You kind of have to ask, like, which problem do I want to have? And it's not a rhetorical question, because the problem you might want to have is actually better if you just use Terraform to do everything. Or you might look at it and say, okay, well, this solves a very specific problem if I can use Terraform to do everything at once. But as a consequence, it's going to break in some really novel and unpleasant ways. And maybe I'd rather do something that seems a little bit more difficult, but it's going to be a lot easier to operate, especially when I hand it off to somebody else on my team and go on vacation for 2 weeks.
I think you got like really good points there. I'm just gonna +1 myself in, Kerim. I'm sorry.
No, definitely. I'm on board with this. But
yes.
Please.
Okay. I think on the note of what you're saying about choosing the kind of problems you want to have and how it could get really spectacular, I think for me personally, the idea of maybe making a typo in a Nomad job that affects more than just the job itself while it's in this plugin is really scary. Like, I wouldn't want to possibly bring down, I don't know, my networking or like my actual machine, because maybe I've made a mistake in a job, or maybe it's not separated enough, or maybe, oh God, this is an old problem I had with Kubernetes and Terraform. I don't know if it's fixed yet, so please, if it is, let me know. But we had a problem before where when we were running in production and we tried to add a couple of labels to our cluster, it would actually tear the whole cluster down and recreate it. And so things like that would be a concern I would have with running Nomad specifically in Terraform. I'd be really scared of kind of accidentally, basically accidentally playing outside of the lines I intended to. So
that's a really good point, especially when you define dependencies in Terraform. Something that should be an in-place update might become a destructive update as a consequence of that.
I think the point here is obviously you want problems that you understand. When you get paged in the middle of the night, you don't want stuff that breaks in a spectacular way. You want that for conference season, but not when you're on call. That's how I see it. There's great learning opportunities, and I'm sure we all have good stories for that. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't break in a reliable way that you can immediately understand, yeah, coloring within the lines can help for that. Jacquie, question for you. Do you have any fun Nomad SRE stories in addition to the ones you've shared, but specifically around storage?
So my storage stories, I haven't gotten to do too much storage with Nomad yet. Most of it's actually completely public. I did a CSI feature demo, I guess, last year that Charlie helped me a lot with putting together. And I haven't really been able to play with it too much. But I imagine that some of the Kubernetes problems I had, not Kubernetes itself, but storage, just to be very clear. I'm sure that some of those things come through. I would imagine that you'll probably run into issues with things like if you wanted to take a Helm chart or perhaps a Docker Swarm kind of config file and just drop that into jobs, you might run into issues around I'll just say what happened to me. It's much easier than trying to talk around it. We had an issue where we had a file that was basically it said that many pods or things are going to read one volume, and that works locally, and it did not in GCP because GCP was like, oh no, we do one-to-one, we don't do this. So what it actually did was it failed silently for weeks, literally weeks. You would see the logs come in to the worker, and then they're supposed to go to something else, and you were supposed to be able to kind of index and look at them there. So they'd come in and you'd see them get received, and then they would just disappear into the void. And it was what is happening? Why is this happening? It took us 6 weeks to find it. We rebuilt the whole thing with VMs. It worked. We rebuilt it locally. It worked. We'd deploy it and we'd be what is going on? And it ended up just being that Google was I don't like having multiple things right to the same storage. So I think my lesson out of that for probably Nomad or any kind of storage that you're running on a cloud with an orchestrator is just to kind of be aware of spots like that where it might be tricky. It might be doing a multi-reader write, and just kind of be aware of how your permissions work. And I think that'll kind of save you a lot of mysterious headaches in the future. And also if you do have a mysterious thing, it's a good place to jump into and be is it here? Because we tried a lot of other places first. We tried pod security rules, all kinds of stuff before we got to storage and realizing that was the problem. So
that does sound like a very nice experience, very educational too. We've got about 2 minutes left. I'm curious, Charlie, any closing thoughts on, hey, day 2 operations, do this, don't do that? One thing each.
Day 2 operations, metrics, absolutely. Start collecting metrics. Even if you don't know what they're for, put them someplace. I think that is the most important thing. Something coming soon. We're working on learn guides that are going to sort of talk about in more detail. Right now I'm working on one that migrates a Java workload that's a SOAP proxy, so that and my dream is that eventually it will become a SOAP proxy that helps run and connect and talks to a remote service. That's my future imaginings. But yes, that's the tease is that. Also, yes, metrics, even if you don't get them.
Byron, for you, same question. Because I don't want to talk about
on metrics. A very day 2 thing is make sure if you're going to autoscale to feed the right metrics to your autoscaler. We see a lot of kind of day 1 examples using CPU for autoscaling, which I think is an excellent example, because if you're on Linux, you can type yes and just pin the CPU, autoscale. I think CPU is not always the metric that tells you a service is busy. You could have a service that's incredibly CPU efficient, but that becomes saturated. I'm thinking of certain Python or Ruby services where you have a finite number of threads that can handle requests. And so you'll be looking in your APM and going, this service is operating fine. It's handling requests quickly. Why are we getting timeouts about it? measure your saturation. And then once you're measuring your saturation, auto scale on it.
These are good ones. Jackie, final
day
thoughts,
two.
do's and don'ts.
Oh man, all right. My standard orchestration one, it's really anything, is if you're doing your security right before you go live, you're gonna have a bad time. Point blank, you are going to have a bad time as somebody who has face planted into this wall over and over, despite asking for it to not be at the last minute over and over. I got feels here. It's a lot harder to kind of restrict out everything after you have all these jobs or batch jobs or who knows what's running really by the time you get there. It could be tons of things. It could be small things. It could be many clusters, many environments. If you're putting your security in towards the end, you're just gonna have a bad time. It's a lot easier to kind of build it out as you go. And that way, if you're changing a security rule, maybe you're breaking one thing at a time instead of your entire cluster. Like, just take it early, take it one step at a time, and make sure that you're not pushing it off to the end. That is my hill to die on when it comes to day two. So
I take back everything I said. ACL's day one. Jackie is absolutely right.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
Yes, we have a learn guide to promote for that, right?
Yeah, we actually have a security page that I found out. Oh, I'm muted. I'm not muted. You're lying
Not
to me,
muted.
Zoom.
You're good.
Okay. Zoom was like, you're muted. I was like, am I though? I'm pretty sure I clicked it. We have a really good security guide. It's like right on the main page. I'm sorry, I'm clickety-clacking as I try and find it quickly. I got pointed to it pretty early in, and it was nice to kind of read through and help. We do have learn guides as well. I'm just gonna drop that in chat. And then we also can have like, other example repos as well. And I'm kind of hoping to see us get some more like production-ish ready security things out in the future, but do not hold me to that immediately. I'll do my best.
I think it's a very valid point, right? Security should be a day one, at worst a day two thing, and not a day one before go live thing, or one day before go live. What are words and what is word order anyway?
Oh, I one last thought. Dev agents
Please.
are not clusters. They feel different. They work different. They behave differently. Do not believe for a moment that things that you experience on a dev agent are exactly how it's going to go in real life. Please consider.
Machine.
Please consider. Yes, exactly. Worked on my machine.
Okay, Wong, get out of here.
Ooh. Well, on that note, I think we're all out of here. Charlie, Byron, Jackie, thank you so much for joining today's office hours.
It's been so
Loved
fun.
the questions. Love the learnings, most of all. Thank you for letting me host you.
Thank you
To
so
our
much
audience.
for hosting.
Yes,
Of
thank
course.
you. Oh my gosh, thanks for the audience. Love my community.
Very, very good questions. If you like our office hours, we have a few more coming up. For example, tomorrow on the language server protocol with my colleague Tracy Holmes and Audrey Eschright. Join us here in about 21 hours from now. So you don't have to do time zones and I don't have to do time zones, which is a win for everyone. And on that note, have a great rest of your day, no matter if that's Wednesday, Thursday, or Nomad Day.